of the divided kingdom here. So we are going to be covering 3 kings today, 2 kings of the north and 1 king of the south. And then we're also going to be discussing there in 1 Kings chapter 13, 2 Kings chapter 13, where we find about the passing of Elijah. So just looking at our schedule here, we're getting toward the end, right? We have just a little bit over a month left here of classes. So we're getting down toward the bottom of this. This is a little bit truncated, but we're down here. And I just thought we would start talking about where we have come on the timeline. Many of you may remember that in the first couple classes, this is one of the timelines we put out, and there's still some copies back there if you want to see that. But just looking at the time period when we are looking at the kings here, we're going to be covering those 2 kings in the north, so Jehoaz and Jehoash, and then Amaziah in the south, which means obviously Elisha is still one of the primary prophets, the primary prophet to Israel. He's going to actually die during this class. The prophet Joel has been doing his work in the south, in Judah. And then we would see there that Amos is going to be the one that directly follows Elisha in speaking to the kings of the north there. I just wanted to do a quick review of where we're at. It's been since we didn't have class on Sunday. It's been a full week now, and Darrell did a great job last Wednesday of putting together a chart kind of showing the relationship with the kings and those kind of things. I had put one together years ago that I thought would share with you, kind of just works if we walk through it all at once. If we start with in Judah, the king Asa, and in Israel, the king Omri. You may remember these were 2 kings that were at it quite a bit at first, but yet when Omri dies, then his son Ahab takes over in the north. Asa then dies, and his son Jehoshaphat is going to be taking over in Judah in the south. And despite the kings of Judah being told, don't mess with people in Israel because they're going to be your downfall, what does Jehoshaphat do? He's like enamored with Ahab for some reason. Even though Ahab is the worst of the worst, he's the one in the Bible that it says he did more to anger God than anybody else. Still, Jehoshaphat wants to be his friend, and so they're constantly together. Even though Ahab makes him look a fool several times, for some reason, Jehoshaphat just wants that relationship. But of course, we know Ahab is going to die in battle, and his son Ahaziah takes over. And Jehoshaphat still wants to be part of the family there, so he builds a whole fleet of ships together with Ahaziah. They kind of conspire to do that. Well, 2 other members of Ahab's family that Darrell talked about were Athaliah and Jehoram, or sometimes called Joram there. But after Ahaziah dies, he dies without any children, and so his brother Jehoram becomes the king, another son of Ahab here. Well, in that time, Jehoshaphat is going to die, and his son named Jehoram is going to rule. So for the first time, we have 2 kings in each nation that are named the exact same thing, and it can get really confusing when you're reading through the text there. Not a surprise that Jehoshaphat named his son after the son of his good friend Ahab. I don't understand it, but okay. So then, of course, to continue it, make it even worse, Jehoram marries Athaliah, who is the sister of Ahaziah and Jehoram. Possibly a different relationship, but the strongest contextual relationship there seems to be sister. So then Jehoram is going to die, and his son Ahaziah, which you recognize that name, that's the name of his uncle, is going to be king here now. And then they go to see each other. Ahaziah goes to see his uncle, and that is where Jehu catches up with them and kills them both, as Darrell covered last week here. So they both die, and Jehu takes over in Israel. And he is perhaps the only king in Israel. We've said that all of the kings in Israel were bad, but he's really the only king in Israel of which some good things are said about him. Because he does what God tells him to do, which is to do what? Kill all of Ahab's family. That's right, okay? So he gets on it and he takes care of that like he was instructed to here. So now, Google's trying to translate my class to somebody else. So now, of course, we know that Athaliah sees this opportunity and she is going to usurp the throne. Actually, it says she kills the entire royal family here. Now, there is some question about whether, and Darrell brought this up last week, about whether she was actually trying to kill her own grandchildren, or were these just other people who were, kind of the distant cousins and brothers and things like that she was just wiping out to secure her throne. But to me, it always seems like she was just killing everybody, irregardless of their relationship to her, and she gets them all except for who? That's right, okay? So we're going to have Joash, who is hidden away by, ends up being his aunt, who is the wife of the high priest there. And so Jehoiada is going to keep him hidden for 7 or 8 years here. And this has always reaffirmed my belief that he was worried if he had delivered Joash up, what would have happened? Athaliah might have killed him, right? Okay? And so maybe not. Maybe she would have tried to rule through him or things. We don't know. But for whatever reason, he keeps Joash hidden for that time until he kind of builds this coalition. And then he comes back and says, hey, here's Joash, the long-lost son of the king. Everybody pronounces him as king. And so Athaliah then gets hers and she is killed. So at the end of class last time, we left off with Jehu and Joash being the king here. I did want to do just a quick summary of Joash. I don't have a whole lot of stuff to talk about today, so I'm doing some summary and review because of that. Some quick idea about Joash. Made king when he was 7 years old. We know he reigned 40 years, and that he was a good king for most of his reign. It's estimated that probably 30 or maybe a little more, plus or minus, of his years, of his 40 years of total kingship, he was good. Because he did good the entire time who was alive? Jehoiada, that's right, okay? And it even says, and Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all of the days of Jehoiada the priest, okay? So as good, though, as his first 30 years were, his last years were just an absolute disaster. Here, going to find out, okay? So really we have two Joashes. We have Joash the good king, who repairs the temple, right? He actually repairs the temple. It took several years. He is in charge of all aspects of the building of the temple. Maybe Jehoiada is really kind of leading him in that. He keeps the workers honest. He actually takes over direct control of the money and makes sure we give the money direct to the workers instead of going through this priestly bureaucracy, which was obviously very corrupt. And of course, even after they finish, he keeps the workers honest enough that he gives them a bunch of money, and whenever they're finished, what do? They give him the leftovers and say, hey, we didn't need all that money. How many contractors do that? But they did, and they kept him honest there. So with that money left over, he used those remaining funds to furnish the temple here. Then, of course, we see Jehoiada dies, 130 years old. If you read through it and didn't think about it, that means he was in his 90s when Athaliah took over and still was vigorous enough to hide away the grandson and to keep the future king safe and to teach him. He's buried with honor, not only in Jerusalem, but buried in the tomb of the kings. Probably says a whole lot about not only what the people thought of him, but of course, what Joash thinks of him, right? Because if Joash didn't think that, he wouldn't be allowed to be buried there. But it does show the respect that people had for him. And of course, I got down here. Joash would have had to approve, but we're going to see how quickly things change here. Because almost immediately, Joash becomes Joash the bad king. He turns away from God. He starts listening to other advisors, who the text calls the princes of Judah. He quits worshiping Jehovah. He turns to worshiping the Asherim or the Asherah and Baal. More typically, we call this the Asherah poles. Sometimes you'll see that written, or the groves. It's all the same. It's that female side counterpart of Baal there. And once he turns away from God, that's when things really start to go bad, okay? So we have Syria is now going to start to invade. And they are going to take Gath and put off for a time their actual invasion, we find in 2 Kings chapter 12. But yet we see here, so this is where Syria controls by this time, all of that over on the east side of the Jordan River. So Israel's territory has been greatly reduced. And the most important thing here is there are two trade routes that Israel makes most of its money from. We talked about, remember, them being the more cosmopolitan people, right? They were traders, and so they were more wealthy. So we have what's called the Way of the Kings, which basically was on the plateau on the east side of the Jordan River. And then, of course, we have the Way of the Sea, which is right along the coast, the easier traveling, actually much faster. But if you control both of those, you can get a lot of taxes because there's no way to get routes from goods from Egypt to the rest of the Fertile Crescent without passing through there, okay? However, now Syria is going to not only take what's on the east side, they are also going to come down the Way of the Sea. They go along the coast and they take over that entire passage there. And then from there, they're going to march and they actually attack Jerusalem for the first time there. And then they go back home, okay? So God tries to warn him, hey, it happened once, Syria came and got you. It's going to happen again if you don't shape up. It says, yet God sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Lord. These testified against them, but they would not pay attention. So much so that Zechariah is moved to speak. Anybody remember who Zechariah was? He was the son of who? Jehoiada. So he was the son of the guy who raised Joash. Joash should have thought of him like a brother, right? I mean, this is the son of the guy who raised me. We don't know their age differences or anything like that. But still, when Zechariah speaks against him, Zechariah gets killed. He's stoned in the courtyard of the temple. It literally says, by the command of the king. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness that Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, had shown him, but killed his son. Of course, Zechariah makes this great final cry, may the Lord see and avenge, which of course we know he's going to do. And so for Joash, the end is now coming. The Syrians come again. They don't need very much this time because what did they do the first time? Smash the army, right? So now there's not a lot of people to defend Israel anymore. And so this time they're not even going to bother to go down the Way of the Sea. They're just going to jump right across the Jordan River, come down out of the plains, and then go back up in the hills to Jerusalem, and they're going to sack Jerusalem here. So they enter Jerusalem. They kill most all of the rulers. They take all the spoil that they can get. Joash ends up being wounded, but they don't kill him. So then they leave Jerusalem. And Joash is eventually killed, but by who? Anybody remember? His own servants, right? So his own servants end up killing him. And then the text says, because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada. I mean, he was such a different person after Jehoiada died. He forgot all of that, and the people just wouldn't abide it anymore, so they go ahead and kill him. All right. So our story then is going to go talking about what's happening in Israel. The next king that we're going to talk about is a guy named Jehoahaz. Okay, he is the 11th king in Israel, but he's the second king in the 5th dynasty already. So we're only 11 kings in, and already 5 times we've had power change from the previous king. So far, up until we get to Jehu, we're going to see that the pattern is typically you have a ruler, maybe his son, and he's a strong ruler. His son will take over, but he's not as strong as his dad, so what happens? Some military leader decides, well, he's weak, and so he takes over. Well, now we have the same pattern repeating. You have a strong leader, his son is not so strong, so what happens? Some other guy comes in and kills that son. So we kind of have this strong king, weak king, new dynasty happen here, okay? Except for Zimri, who wasn't even strong enough to last a month, okay? So he is a son of Jehu, What's interesting about Jehu, remember we said that Jehu is one of the only kings of the north that God actually says he did what I told him whenever he killed all of the family of Ahab. And so because of that, Jehu was given a very special blessing by God. Anybody remember what that was? That's right, 4 generations, okay? So 4 sons of yours, so it's going to be a total of 5 generations, including Jehu. But your dynasty will last until the 4th son. That's what had been promised. That's in 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 30 here. So he begins his reign during the 23rd year of Joash in Judah. And so this means that this is probably still while Joash was a good king, right? Because he probably didn't go bad until year 30 to 32, somewhere in there. And he's going to reign for 17 years here. Well, what do we know about Jehoahaz? Not a whole lot, actually. We know almost nothing about him, okay? We know that he is called evil, that God says he did evil, what was inside of the Lord, because he did what? And if you haven't memorized this phrase by now, you definitely should have. Continued in, or sometimes practiced, or whatever, but it always says the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. What was that sin? The idols, that's right. So sometimes we call that perverted Judaism, because he was not telling the people, hey, we're going to worship these idols and we're going to worship Baal, or we're going to worship these idols, which is the Asherah. He was actually saying we're going to worship these idols, which are what? Jehovah. Yeah. He actually said this is Jehovah, of course, completely against Jehovah's teaching, and he created all the extra feast days and made priests out of the common people and all those kind of things. So he really just perverted the system of Judaism here, okay? Now, because of this, because he is not faithful and because he continues in the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, God is going to have Syria continually plague him and Israel during his reign. Specifically, it says that both Hazael, the king of Syria, and his son, Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, that during their reign, they just are always fighting against Israel. And Israel continues to lose and lose and lose, okay? So much so that it says they decimated Israel's army to less than, and some of these numbers are kind of funny, 50 cavalry. They had less than 10 chariots. I mean, to specifically mention, we've only got 9 or so chariots out here. That's pretty poor. And only 10,000 footmen could be found in all the land to be part of the army here. So that's why he has no chance to defend himself. Syria basically just has their way with Israel for his entire reign here, okay? Except for, as we get kind of close to the end, we think, we don't know exactly when this happened, but it seems to be like it would be closer to the end here. Jehoahaz did have one redeeming moment. So at the height of Syrian oppression, he reaches out to God for help. It says he sought the Lord, okay? And God then is going to recognize that. Is there any other pattern we've seen, not in this class, but not too long ago historically in the Old Testament story, there was a pattern where the people would follow idols and they wouldn't follow God, and then God would allow some outside nation to come in and attack them and oppress them, at least part of them, and they would oppress them until the people finally got, well, we can't solve this on our own. What do we got to do? Well, now we got to call out to God. Okay, what period was that? The Judges. That's right. Okay, so just like during that period of Judges, it says God raises, depending on your translation, a savior or a deliverer. Okay, and that deliverer is going to deliver them out of the hand of Syria. We don't know anything about this person. Literally nothing. We don't even know their name, okay, or where they were from, or what they did. How did they stop Syria from attacking Israel? We don't know. We don't have any clue. But we do know that they didn't use the strength of what? of the army. That's right. Okay, we don't know what he did, but for whatever reason, he didn't raise a whole bunch of soldiers and go, now we've got 10 chariots somehow turned into 1,000, and he beats back this great army. That's just not what happens, okay? Somehow, though, God stays on his side, and God allows this person to deliver or to save the northern nation of Israel out of the hand of Syria here. Now, in the time period of the Judges, we kind of see this pattern repeat, right? Where the people sin, God sends an oppressor, the land has war for X number of years, the people repent, God raises a judge who delivers them, and then we always have a period of what? A peace, of rest, where the people were then what? At least for a generation usually. Yeah, they're faithful, right? They turned back to God. Is that what happens here? No. Okay? So even though God raises a judge, God raises a deliverer here, it says that the deliverer helps them and everyone returns home and everyone gets to go back like they were before, but they still worshiped as Jeroboam dictated, and now even worse, they're going to leave the Asherah, or they're going to leave those foreign idols or those groves where they worship. They're going to leave that within Samaria itself. Okay? So unlike that time of the Judges where God rescuing them kind of sets them straight, at least for a generation or so, this doesn't even last, it seems like a year. People get home and they go right back to doing what they were doing before. Okay? And that's all we know about Jehoahaz. Not a lot. Other than guys like Zimri that we know even less about, he is one of the kings that we know the least about here. Any questions about Jehoahaz? Not a lot to ask, right?
How about the king 7 years old?
Yeah, no 7-year-old king ruled with judgment. No. Yeah, today we would call, maybe not today, more modern times when there was a king, that happened often, right? Where you would have, especially during times of the Crusades and things like that, you would have a king who died and his son was very, very young. That's when a regent would be appointed, somebody who to lead him and guide him. Oftentimes it would be like the queen mother or some other trusted advisor would be that regent. So in this case, that was definitely Jehoiada was that regent. He was the one making the decisions, at least at first, for sure. Which probably explains a lot, right, about why he was a good king at first. All right, so after Jehoahaz dies, the next king in Israel that if we read through the text here comes to Jehoash, okay? So Jehoash is the 12th king of Israel, the third king in the 5th dynasty, because again, he is a son of who? Well, grandson of Jehu, that's right. So remember, the dynasty to the 4th son had been promised, so we're now only to the 2nd son, so we're still going to have 2 more sons of Jehu at least in the north to come here. And we know that he's going to reign for 16 years here. Now, when we talk about Jehoash, he begins his reign during the 37th year of Joash in Judah, which means now we're definitely into the time when Joash was a bad king. So Joash in the south has now turned from the Lord, he's turned from the teachings of Jehoiada, and he is now 100% committed to being a bad guy. So one thing I want you to note here, especially as we are jumping between Kings and 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, sometimes you will see him called Jehoash, but also you will see him called Joash. They're the same word, just slightly different spellings. So once again, just like when we had Jehoram, at the same time we had 2 kings named identical, for a period here of roughly 3 years or so, we have this period where the king in the south and the king in the north have the same identical name. And that can get pretty confusing, especially when you read toward the end of 2 Chronicles. It just says Jehoash, 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 and you're like, well, which Jehoash? Okay, so just kind of keep that straight there, that they're both named that. 2 Kings tends to keep them separate, Joash and Jehoash. It uses the two different spelling to clearly delineate that, but not so much in 2 Chronicles. So that's all we find out about him as he becomes king, until for a second the story's going to step aside and we are going to hear about the death of a prophet. So after all of this time, Elisha becomes sick, perhaps the greatest prophet of the Old Testament outside of Moses. You may remember that he asked when Elijah went up into the chariot of fire, right, with horses of fire, that he asked for the double portion to be given to me. And it seems like if we read through that, Sam, several classes ago, did a great job of outlining that, of how, at least of what we know, he gave double the prophecies and double the miracles. So perhaps one of the greatest prophets here, he becomes sick. We're not sure what it is, but he knows, perhaps God tells him, or he's just getting old, we're not sure, but whatever it is, he knows this is it. I now have contracted the disease or the sickness that's going to kill me here. So he puts the call out, and who comes to see him? The king, right? Makes sense, okay? Kind of. So Jehoash, or Joash, depending on which one you read it in there, comes to visit him. And it's kind of a strange visit here. First of all, it might be a strange visit because was Jehoash a particularly faithful guy? No. In fact, it says he did evil in the sight of the Lord, okay? So why does he care about Elisha? We don't know. And then he travels to see him, and when he finally gets there, he makes this strange cry to Elisha, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." What in the world is that? Why would you say that to Elisha? Well, does that sound familiar to anybody, that phrase? It should. Just a couple classes ago, when we talked about Elisha and Elijah, right? When Elijah is literally being carried away from him, what does he cry out? my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." Now, in that case, it seemed to make sense, right? Because what is Elijah doing? Yeah, in a chariot and a horseman of God, he's being carried away. That seems to make sense. Seems to make no sense why that happens here with Elisha. But yet, somehow, whether that is God working through him or because the story has spread, but somehow Jehoash knows what has been said before, and he repeats those exact same words, maybe trying to comfort Elisha. I'm not sure here, okay? But Elisha now is going to deliver his final prophecy. He's talking with the king, and he says, "Get a bow and open the window." He actually puts his hand on the bow with him, and he says, "Shoot the bow out the window to the east." Jehoash doesn't argue. He just does what he says. And so now Elisha is going to proclaim, hey, that shot represents the bow of victory or the arrow of victory that is going to give Israel victory over Syria here. And he tells Joash, you are going to go and fight with Syria at a place called Aphek. Did anybody try to look that up? If you do, be ready to find it in like 8 different places. Depending on which map you read through, which historian, we really don't know where it is, okay? There were lots of cities that could have been called that. I tend to think it's on the border, right on the, there is a town that potentially could have been in. It's right on the border close to the Jordan River. That seems to make sense to me, but we really don't know. Wherever it is, that's where the battle is going to be, where Joash will finally win over the Syrians. And then he says, now, you see those arrows over there, the ones you didn't shoot? And Joash says, yeah. So he says, pick up those arrows and now beat the ground, okay? Okay, whatever you say. And so he takes those and he smacks the ground 3 times. Now, to me, that seems like a good idea, right? I mean, in the Bible, 3 is a pretty good number. If you want to think about, one of the numbers to guess, 3 is definitely going to be one of the ones that are going to be up there. But Elijah becomes angry at him. Anybody remember why? Yeah. So it turns out that by him hitting the ground with those arrows, that was God saying, this is how many times you're going to win over Syria, okay? So that means that because he only hit the ground 3 times, it means Joash will only win over Syria 3 times. He won't win 4 or 5 here, okay? So Elisha gets mad and says, well, you should have struck the ground more. If you would have struck it 5 or 6 times, then you could have beat him and crushed him forever. But how was Joash or Jehoash supposed to know that? You didn't tell him. He just said, strike the ground. I bet if he told him, hey, you strike the ground and however many times you hit, you're going to win in battle, I bet Jehoash would still be hitting the ground, right? I mean, I would have never stopped until my arm fell off. But he didn't know. And so, but for whatever reason, he says that, so that 3 times is what God prophesies, you will beat Syria 3 times here. So Elisha then dies, and he's buried. Now this story becomes really weird unless you remember that they didn't bury people then like we bury people now. When we bury people now, what do? We dig a great big deep hole, we put them in a wooden casket or something, and we surround that wooden casket with a concrete block to keep it from floating up in the water, and we bury it way down there, okay? This is more burial like they did then, which was what? Anybody remember what was the primary way they buried people in Palestine? In a cave, that's right. They would have caves that people would buy, and that was their cemetery, okay? And so he's laid to rest in some kind of cave or tomb. We don't really know exactly which it is, but he is laid to rest in there in all honor. But then we get this really weird passage about this strange miracle that happens here. Okay? And the miracle at least becomes more understandable if you remember he's not buried 6 feet under the ground, right? Okay? So, sometime later, could have been right away. Doesn't seem to be like right away because it talks about his bones. So maybe, the flesh is already completely decomposed and it's just a skeleton in there. But sometime later, another man dies and is being buried. Well, what about that man? We don't know. Where was he from? What did he do? How did he die? What was his name? We don't know anything about him. It just says a man was being buried, okay? However, because this is the time when Israel's not strong, so there are some Moabite raiders that are working in the area. And as the people who were going to bury this guy, they were going to bury him in the same cave, apparently, where Elisha was buried. Normally, what would they do? They'd carry the body in and they'd find a place that was empty and they would lay it in there very nice and everything would be respectful and they would leave. Yes, there would be all the other bodies and stuff around them, but now because of these Moabite raiders, what do? They just kind of chuck his body in the cave and what happens? Yeah. As soon as that man's body touches Elisha's bones, boom, he's back to life. Okay, it says he stood up on his own feet. What does this mean? I don't know. Guess what else we know about this miracle? Nothing. This is all we know. It's another one of those kind of strange miracles that we have here where apparently the power of Elijah was given in double portion to Elisha, so much so that just his bones laying there, when this guy's dead body hits it, he's revived. But that's all we know. We don't know why. We don't know what this guy went on to do. Was he somebody special in God's plan? We don't know. It's one of those strange stories we find during this time period. All right. So now we know that Jehoash is king in the north, and we know that Elisha has died. So now in 2 Kings, we're going to jump back down to Judah for a minute here. And this is where we also pick up the story in 2 Chronicles chapter 25. So in the south, in Judah, Amaziah is going to become king. He is the 8th king of Judah of a single dynasty still, right? Because he is still of the dynasty of who? Of David, right? Okay. Interestingly enough, and Darrell pointed this out on last Wednesday. He's the 9th ruler. There's a lot of question about, was Athaliah legitimate? I mean, she did rule for 7 years, but she didn't have proper authority. She wasn't of the line. So he really is the 8th king, but the 9th person in the list of rulers here. He begins his reign in the 2nd year of Joash of Israel. He's 25 when he becomes king. We know he reigns for 29 years. And he mostly does what is right. In fact, it says he does what was right in the sight of the Lord, but what? Anybody remember? Yeah. In 2 Kings it says, but yet not quite like his father David. And 2 Chronicles tells us what that means. It means yet not with a whole heart. You know, David was a man after God's whole heart. He served God with his whole heart. Well, it seems like Amaziah does the acts and he, follows in the way of David, but yet he's not really committed. It's not really in his whole heart to do that. Well, when he becomes king, he very quickly consolidates his power. And the first thing he's going to do is take some vengeance. Who is he going to take vengeance against? Remember what happened to his father. He got killed by servants, right? So the first thing he's going to do is he kills all the servants who killed his father, but he actually shows some mercy here. Typically, whenever a new king was coming to power and he would get rid of people, what would he get rid of? Their entire family, right? The whole ball of wax, okay? But here it says specifically he saves their children. Most scholars believe that really he just killed the servants who did the work. He kind of spared their families here from that. And he very quickly becomes a strong king in Judah. He raises a very strong army, and he knows that God is going to be on his side when he goes to battle. So he's going to prepare for war. If you're a strong king, that's what you do. You fight your battles. So he raises an army of 300,000 men from Judah and Benjamin. It says all men who are 20 years or older, they're able to hold a spear and a shield, and they're ready to go out for war. And also, just because he wants to be extra sure, he hires 100,000 Ephraimites from out of Israel, pays them 100 talents of gold for them to come be his mercenaries, okay? However, God is not pleased with this. Not pleased with which part? Yeah, the hiring the Ephraimites, right? Okay. He's okay with raising the army, but in fact, he sends a prophet to visit Amaziah and says, hey, you should trust in God, not these mercenaries. Raise your army, that's great, let's go. But you don't need to hire someone from Israel, because what had God told the kings in the south to do? Stay away from them. Don't mess with them, okay? So Amaziah, just like any king, is worried about the money. Well, I already paid him 100 talents of gold, and what about that? And the man of God promises, 100 talents of gold, that's nothing to God. Don't worry about it. He can give you much more than that. So Amaziah dismisses the Ephraimites. Hey, go home. And then they're mad. I don't understand why. Because after all, what happened? They got paid. And they didn't have to go fight. None of them had to die. I'd be like, man, this is the best job ever. But they don't like it, okay? And so we're actually told several passages down that on their way home, they pretty much pillage all of the towns all the way back until they get up into Israel. It says that they kill 3,000 people and they take a whole bunch of spoil. We don't know why, but they're very mad that they didn't get to go fight. Okay. So now Amaziah is going to go to war with Edom here. He and his armies go down to Edom, and they meet the armies of Edom at a place called Seir. And there they kill 10,000 men outright. They capture another 10,000 alive, which you would think that's going to be slaves or prisoners or something like that. Nope. What do they do with them? Anybody remember? Pretty brutal. They take them up to the top of a cliff and throw them off till they're broken to pieces at the bottom of the cliff. Why they didn't just kill them in battle, I don't know. But for whatever reason, they killed 10,000 outright. This other 10,000 they capture. They push them off a cliff so that they die. Okay. Now they bring all of those spoils back to Jerusalem. Here at my computer. As part of the spoils, they bring back the idols of Edom. Now, this would not be surprising because typically, what would those idols be? Gold and jewels and, right? Just like Israel, the temple was coated in gold and jewels and all silver and all this kind of stuff. Most idols would have been made out of very precious elements. So they bring them back. However, Amaziah goes into perhaps the stupidest form of idolatry you could ever read about in the Bible. I don't understand it. So he sets up those idols. He becomes enamored by them. And he sets up those idols and starts to worship them and to make offerings to them. Well, how do you think God feels about that? He doesn't like it, of course. Okay, so the Lord becomes very angry, and he sends a prophet to talk to him. And this prophet delivers probably the best message for anybody to talking about idols, right? Why in the world, why have you sought after the gods of the people who did not deliver their own people from your hand? These are gods that were so weak that when you went to attack them, you completely crushed their people and you captured these idols. Now all of a sudden you think there's something? Makes no sense whatsoever, 0 sense. But Amaziah threatens that prophet. If you don't stop saying that kind of stuff, you're going to be destroyed. So the prophet stops rebuking him, but kind of says on his way out, well, that's okay. I'll shut up because I know God has determined he's going to destroy you. So he kind of gets his last little dig in there anyway on his way out. So this Amaziah's foolish idolatry leads right into Amaziah's foolish pride. He now decides that he needs somebody else to fight, and so let's go fight against Israel. Okay? Perhaps because of what the Ephraimites did, on their way back, they destroyed a bunch of towns, so maybe he's trying to get vengeance. We're not told. He just decides that he wants to fight against Israel, and so God is going to use his foolishness to extract his punishment here. So Amaziah challenges Joash. Hey, come let us look one another in the face. It's kind of a strange challenge, but Amaziah is all puffed up. Yeah, I'll fight you one-on-one. Now, Joash, depending on the spelling, tries to avoid the battle. He warns Amaziah, hey, you don't got a chance. What are you doing here? He tells this crazy story about a cedar and a thistle, and the thistle says, give me your daughter. And before the cedar can even respond, an animal comes and tramples the thistle, right? Nothing, one compared to the other. And he even tells him, explains it if he didn't get it. Hey, you beat Edom, that's great. Now you're all excited. Why don't you just stay with that glory, stay home and be happy instead of doing something stupid, and all of Judah will fall with you. Well, of course, Amaziah doesn't listen. If you read in 2 Chronicles, it may be that God closed his ears to that, or God hardened his heart, because this is how God was going to enact his judgment. So they go to war at a place called Beth Shemesh. So I know that this is not the most accurate map at this time, because all of this is controlled by Syria pretty much at this time. But Beth Shemesh is right here pretty close to Jerusalem. That just gives you a good idea of how little territory Judah still controls at this point, that Israel is that close there at Beth Shemesh. Okay? So, of course, just like it was predicted, Israel wins. Okay? Kind of surprising because of how weak Israel was under Jehoahaz. Now his son has got a big enough army to beat up Israel, but God was on Israel's side because they were against Judah. So Amaziah is captured. They return to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is sacked. A huge portion of the wall is completely destroyed. All the treasures of the temple are taken, but yet Amaziah is returned to Jerusalem. Jehoash doesn't kill him. But this is going to be the last thing we know about both of these rulers. Jehoash returns to Samaria. We don't know exactly how much longer, but there he dies without us knowing anything more. That's really all we know about him, is this interaction with him and Elisha, and then him and Amaziah. Okay? Amaziah outlives Jehoash, okay? He lives 15 more years, it says, but he's on the run for much of that. And who is he on the run from? His own people, actually, okay? His own people in Jerusalem conspire against him because he had turned from God and he had turned to that idolatry, which was so foolish. So he's on the run most of the time. He hides out in Lachish, but he gets discovered and killed, and then he's returned to Jerusalem for burial. Okay? And I think, if I could hear it, I would bet that bell is going to ding already, or it's going to ding any second, because maybe the most perfectly timed class I've ever had. So thank you very much, and we will continue with the story in the north and the south on Sunday. I think Ben is up next. Is that right? He walked out. I think that's right, Darrell, right? Yeah.